I just wanted to bring us all together to talk about the fellowship practice and the dialectic practice and the circling practice because they can be confusing and they can be technical and they're really cool and people want to know more about them. So it seems like someone could find this useful. And episode 10 is a lot, right? Like if you watch it and you take it all in, and you really kind of soak in what's happening there. Like there's quite a bit of humanity being unearthed and being revealed and being experimented with. So it's kind of cool for people that have maybe seen that and want to kind of dig into some of that some more. So I thought we'll go through talking about just the meditation contemplation practice at the beginning, and then I don't know, Taylor, I'm just gonna put you on the spot. Do we call it circling? I'm afraid to use this word because I'm gonna get thrown in like a kind of court in Texas or something, or like what is this interpersonal, dialogical, meditative, contemplative
I
act?
know, I know lawyers in Texas, so you're covered, Rob. Don't worry.
It's a big state. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, John, and I suppose maybe Guy too, tend to call these circling practices. They don't occur to me as that, but there are certainly like building blocks to circling. I would call those practices more authentic relating practices. They're sort of I use that analogy often of like going to the gym, going to the weight room and there's these machines, right? And you sort of sit in one of the machines and to isolate a particular muscle. And to me, that's a little bit different than, all that cross training that you're doing to, run a marathon or something like that. To me, circling is the marathon, not necessarily as exhaustive as running a marathon is, but it's sort of the combination of all your training sort of comes into that particular practice. But the stuff that we do sort of in the lead up, I like it a little bit more, as I think John refers to it as building the phylea, something about that. It's, sort of the gathering of the logs, putting us into these various asanas, as Guy would say, to put us in a bit of a circling stance, but I wouldn't call them circling practices. I don't know if that's clear or if I just muddied the waters more.
No, that's good. That's because I get what you're saying, because you're saying it's not circling, because circling is this very complex set of psychotechnologies that kind of culminate from all this practice, and these are like little tools to help the phylea aspect of the practices of fellowship and dialectic and dialogos. Great. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at those four things: the meditation and contemplation, the authentic relating, phylea practice, and then the two kind of bigger practices. And I'll definitely open this to everyone, so it's gonna be very, very free flow. I'll probably say very little, and maybe just with the contemplation part, Chris, I wonder, like, really with you, why there's so much, right? That episode 10, that contemplation goes on for like 30 minutes, and John slowly introduces these practices over 9 weeks, basically, and then in 30 minutes, like 9 weeks of practices show up in this like mega practice. So what is that? What is it trying to afford? And maybe also like what level of expertise in those things should someone have when they practice them?
Good questions all. So one thing I might say is the example that John gave, if you're looking for something a bit tighter, the one he did in Thunder Bay, which all four of us were present for together, which was lovely, is I think a little bit, maybe a bit friendlier to some people than to have to go through the entire series, pick up the different pieces and instruments along the way, and then to have to bring them all together in 10. I get it. It's a tall order. The one he gave in Thunder Bay, by my recollection, I haven't rewatched it since, so if you haven't got a different take, tell me. But I remember that being a fairly good condensation of the both the meditation and the Neoplatonic contemplation exercises. So that might be a quicker stop for people looking. I don't feel like I I don't feel comfortable doing that instruction because I don't have John, like the fellowship and the dialectic and the dialogos is different. But for the meditation and for the Neoplatonic contemplation, those are John's in a way, not to say that John's the only person who teaches meditation, but the particular way that he teaches that and the particular way that he does the Neoplatonic contemplation is so specific to his craft. Mm-hmm. And so specific to his synthesis of these ideas that it is very hard to replicate. So I would say for those, go to the source. But one way of understanding the difference between the two, and this comes from more of John's Buddhist background more than it does necessarily his Neoplatonic background, but he has sort of integrated the two of them, is this idea that sort of to put it in his cogsci terms, basically what you're doing, it's sort of an intentional scaling practice, right? So what you're doing is in the meditation practice is basically what you're doing is you're scaling down attention from the gestalt to the featural by trying to call your own attention to the various ways in which your attention is being distributed and what's populating it and what's occurring as you apply that attention, right? You're trying to basically take the frame, step back from it, and notice all the different individual components that are going into creating that frame when you step into it and feel through it, right? So instead of feeling and seeing and thinking through the frame, you're trying to step back from it and notice all of the feelings and the sensations and the particular idiosyncratic traits and strains and all the things that are going into creating it. And so that's what I mean by the scaling down of attention. At the same time, what you're doing, again, using, I think this is the Polanyi cogsci language, is you're trying to do a transparency opacity shift. You're basically trying to take whatever it is that you're thinking through and seeing through and look at it. So the meditation, that first part of the twin pair of practices, is the stepping back, the noticing what's going on. Why, what is it that's actually moving my thinking, moving my attention, composing it, all of that. And then the second part, which is the contemplation, is really doing the reverse, right? It's the shift from opacity back into transparency. And it's the scaling back up of attention from the feature to the gestalt, right? So now that I've stepped back from the frame that determines my salience and what stands out to me and what's important to me and what I'm feeling, what I'm then going to do is I'm actually going to begin little by little, and this is why literally the practice, or symbolically, I should say, the practice is using scaling up, right? From the phusis to the henosis to the theosis, the different components of the contemplation are actually trying to recreate a new frame of attention by taking different ingredients of sensing, carefully stacking and lathering them together, and then stepping into this thing that you're creating to see through it and to feel through it and to think through it. Now that you've done all of the meditative stepping back, now you're doing the contemplative stepping forward. And the reason that the two practices are always paired together is that it's a bidirectional movement, right? You're trying to move up and down at the same time. You're trying to step back and forward at the same time so that you're fanning out your attention and then collapsing it back together to know what to concentrate on, what to pay attention to, how best to pay attention, how to care, all of his language that goes into the relevance realization argument. So that's kind of why you can't have one. I think he would say you can't have one without the other, and that they always come paired together. They're really twin practices. And that one is extending yourself out further into the world, and one is retreating, not in a escapist exercise, but sort of retreating back into yourself to sort out what it is that's going on, to make sense of what's going on with your perception itself, so that when you reach back out, you can reach back out with a sense of freshness about what greets you. So sorry, I don't know if that's helpful. I hope it is, but that is just trying to get at the gist of what we're doing when we do those two practices and why why it's two and not just one or the other.
Yeah, when you, Taylor and Lizelle, when you hear all that, is there anything else that makes you want to question what he said, or anything, or add to what he said, or challenge what he said? Not challenge.
I do actually want to add something as someone who's not an expert but a participant. What I experienced when I show up for these practices, I'm usually quite anxious. I think it's normal. I think most people, when they interact with other human beings, are a bit anxious in the beginning, maybe more so for introverts, I don't know. Maybe more for extroverts, I actually heard, because extroverts are more aware of other people. And then when I sit down and we start the meditation, I can literally feel myself, like just calming down. And maybe that is the meditation part, like that just, okay, getting into my body, just getting into the moment, just calming down. And then preparing the contemplation part, I think, preparing indeed what you mentioned about putting on the switch on your attention, something like that. Like, so you start then with this, just relaxing, getting rid of some of that anxiety, and then getting you in the mode to contemplate, because the philosophical fellowship and the dialectic in Dialogos is group contemplation, if I'm not mistaken. So it's getting you in that mood. That's how I experience it. And Taylor, I wanted to say, because you mentioned, maybe circling is not as challenging as a marathon. For an introvert, it pretty much is as challenging as a marathon. So, and I think that's why it's good to do the meditation before the circling or the fellowship, so that you can get into yourself before you try to connect with other people.
Yeah,
so
totally. Yeah, it occurs to me, Lizelle, something that I don't know that you're pointing directly at it, but it brings up for me is that this is one way in how we relate to practices. And, I think Christopher did a great job of explicating the intention and why there's these two and how they complement each other and sort of their purpose. But there's also just the actual experience of stepping into a practice. And for some, one thing that for me in, in authentic relating, I try not to tell people what they're supposed to get out of it, because it starts to sort of shape them in a way that might not be fitting. So if I were to come into the contemplation and meditation and share all the things that Christopher did, that might enhance anxiety. Whereas for some people, they might sort of get that opportunity just to slow down and to close their eyes, and just only through being guided to put their attention on one thing, like that can be calming. That can be almost like a holding container for them, and such that they might not notice the different subtleties between the different things that they're paying attention to. They're just not there yet. But the one thing they are going to probably notice is what you're naming is like, that settling, the release of anxiety, the opening up. Like there are secondary things that are sort of happening when we engage in any particular sort of mindfulness exercise. So yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, the sort of the language of training versus language of explaining tension is tricky with these things. It really is tricky. Because, you want to give people a reason to do these things and explain what they're for, but you don't want to trespass on the, if I can use the word, phenomenology of their experience, right? The subjective character of their experience as they're doing it, which is very personal. And you don't want to pull that away from somebody. So it is tough. It's tough to find the balance. But I think you both just now explained beautifully why the meditation does come first. And I think it kind of has to come first, because like you said, Lizelle, and I have this experience too. You come into these practices with quite a bit of, like when we did it and the After Socrates series, also doing it on camera was just a little mind bending, at least for me. It was tough, actually. It was quite difficult to do it in that exposed way. But you have to kind of sit with yourself for a minute and sort out all of the different things that you're bringing in with you that could otherwise, if they go kind of unnoticed, could contaminate a lot of what we're trying to do, a lot. And you see it, when someone comes in with with something like that. If someone comes in with a lot of insecurity or a lot of nerves, as we all do to some degree, I think most of us, but doesn't understand that as a feature of what they're already bringing in, that then becomes attributed to the activity and attributed even to other people. And it really gets its hooks into the whole experience. And that can be really tricky. So yeah, it comes first for a good reason.
Yeah. Yeah, it occurs to me that, one of the goals in terms of the it comes first is getting everybody into the here and now.
Yeah.
So there's that piece of you're bringing something in, and normally in an AR context we do check-ins, sort of that thing to name it to tame it, like, oh, I'm bringing this thing in, this is here, everybody knows, so we get shared reality about it. But then it's sort of like, oh, you can like kind of put it down once you've acknowledged it, like that's even in some ways that's like an IFS sort of move, of like, the part wants to be acknowledged, like that's the first step, is to acknowledge it. But then that just lets you be more here with what is in the moment rather than, tied up. So that could be also the anxiety, right? So that's the thing you're sort of coming in with, whatever the reason is, the nervousness of other people. But if you go through, the meditation and the contemplation, that slowing in and coming into your own experience, you have that opportunity to just sort of let those things go and see what's actually really here, usually in a fairly gentle way. And then, now you're here. Now you're ready.
Nice, Taylor.
Is there anything that, like, if people are trying to shortcut this part of the practice and they go, oh, we just have 5 minutes, or we just want to do the humble wonder and then we're done, is there any kind of like fears to avoid or things to avoid? When people get creative, people just do exactly the practice and they have the kind of cognitive flexibility to realize that there's a lot of play involved in the practice, that you don't have to copy it perfectly. But if they want to cut corners, like, is there any things to avoid or other tips for people? Because I know, like, just even with Lizelle and I, we talk to people, and some people go like, oh, I've been doing it for a year, or I do it every couple of weeks. So there's people doing this like in the wild, lots and lots of different ways. And is there any advice for those kind of people?
I only do it in captivity, never in the wild. That's a stupid joke.
It's actually really funny because of other reasons.
One of the things I used to find is that, especially when, I would be going to do a dialogue or a dialogos, it hadn't quite been schematized, initially the way it is now, maybe. But I would be about to hop on and be a little bit nervous about doing it, or just be out of it, feel like my head just wasn't in it and I didn't really feel like doing it. And I kind of wanted to just renege on the commitment and duck out, and felt like, nah, I can't do that. I committed to something. I got to go forward. One of the things that I found and started to trust is that, and I think this is especially true of the formality of these practices, but I even found that it was true informally if a dialogue or dialogos was kind of had the right kind of right spirit attached to it, is that I found that the process would give me the attitude I needed to undertake the process. And that's a bit of you need some trust in that to get the idea of that, right? So if I don't feel like it's the same thing I find doing something more movement based, right? Like going to do martial arts. Like I never feel like going to the dojo ever. Not like almost never. I never feel like, oh, I'm so excited to do it today. I want to be, but I never am. When I get there, I start it comes. And I think that's the thing, is that the reason not to skip any of these phases is that the phases, especially the meditation, especially the centering, the finding your center, the finding your root, focus, flow, the different stages are there because they prepare the attitude you need to undertake the other practices with a little bit less of a neurotic grip on your intestines. And the way to slacken the grip is to do those preparatory activities. It's the warm up. It's like a warm up. You need to warm up. No one can just jump in and like very rarely, unless you're imbued with some kind of real, a special kind of energy. And sometimes that happens. But usually you can just jump in. You have to warm up a bit. And it's just like that. It's pretty simple, actually. But I think that's the reason not to skip it. You don't skip it because the feeling you have going in, the feeling that makes you not want to do it or doubt that you can, is the very feeling that you're trying to slowly, it's the knot you're trying to untie with those warm-ups. And that's why you don't skip them. It's like, yeah, you can try jumping in and maybe it'll work. It might. But it's going to be a bigger.
You might pull a muscle.
You might pull a muscle. Exactly. Well said.
Yeah.
Taylor, Lizelle, any other advice for these kind of fools? I think if we take what Christopher said seriously, these foolish people who are skipping steps. And
well, Rob, since you and I do these practices together, and I'm inclined to skip it. You are calling me a fool, but it's okay. I
none of us are wise.
That I am a fool.
Yeah, I wouldn't call them fools either. Like we all do it. We're all guilty of it, in our own. Like, none of us do this perfectly.
Well, I think it's really interesting because idiosyncratically with different groups, I have groups that I've hung out with. They'll go like, I don't like the meditating, and that part will fall out, or I don't like the circling, authentic relating, whatever word we're going to use for that, and that'll fall to the background, or whatever it is. And I'm always like, no, let's do the whole thing, or even more. Like, because I love when I first started to learn circling, people would just like read one of the 5 principles that was on like the Circling Europe website, and you could feel people that were doing it like, oh, this is wasting of time. Why are we reviewing something we already know? But I always loved it because I felt like it just kind of got in our brains a little bit and gave us some like positive constraints that would kind of like push forward better behavior. And so that's really, I'm glad to hear all of that. Is there any, this might not really matter, but is there any, like, if you've never meditated a lot, or maybe you're just encountering John's work and like these kind of contemplations, or like, what phusis, kenosis, let's slow down here, Mr. Vervaeke. Should people just be kind of working on those things if they're new to them and enjoy the practice, or should they hold off on doing the dialectic or the fellowship if they really don't have 6 months of meditation or the capacity to sit for 5 minutes? Or yeah,
that's a good question. No, I wouldn't say hold off. No. I don't think so. Like I think ideally you do all of these things in conjunction, but like the world's not ideal and situations aren't always ideal. Let's be honest. So, do I do meditation every time before a dialogue? No, of course not, because sometimes time doesn't afford it, or circumstances don't afford it. So like the order of these practices, I think, is it follows a schema, and there's a good reason for it, and there's a lot of thinking behind it. And it seems in practice that something particularly meaningful seems to happen, or something is particularly afforded by doing all of those things in conjunction. Having said that, not everyone can devote an entire day to, or even a few hours altogether to do all of them together. And so, even though there's a certain kind of ideal composition with them all put together, it doesn't mean that they all have to be put together. And I certainly would never say, like, I'm not an expert in meditation, so there's no way, like, I could never ask or expect that of somebody else before doing Dialectic and Dialogos. Will they complement? Yes, they will. And they'll probably reinforce one another in a very potent way. But to say that it's a requirement, I think, is exactly the wrong. I think that would be really giving people the wrong idea and making things seem so rigid and stringent and rule oriented, and they're not.
Taylor, do you want to say something? Or
well, yeah, I think there's that importance of like the phrase that's coming to me is like giving yourself a break in some way, like the sort of that acknowledgement, like don't twist yourself into a pretzel to get into your practice, because that's not a good posture either, right? So how do you wisely do that? Say you've got time constraints or something. And there's also that sense, the frame I look at is like what's integrated and what's not integrated. And the thing is that if you have integrated the ability to cultivate, say, presence and stillness and centering and rootedness in 2-3 minutes, you can do that. You don't have to spend 15, 20, 25 minutes or whatever it is to try to do that because you've integrated it. That said, it's still a good idea. It's still a good idea to get where your home base is. We're different in every moment. And, we use this phrase in AR often. It's like the water that we're swimming in. We don't know that we're swimming in it until we step back and look at it or somebody else points it out to us, right? It's transparent to us. So I think, again, it's, these other warm-up practices provide affordances that increase the chance of the goals of the various practices that follow it. Like, it is a scaffolding. It is very intentional. But yeah, also give yourself a break. Like, if you're really interested in getting to dialectic and to dialogos and, you've run out of time to do like the full contemplation thing. Okay. So then just, try to do a part of that and only do one round of noticing or something like that. And then start playing in that other area. And then maybe you'll notice like, oh yeah, like maybe I should, and then you go back and you do the full set of it and you'll notice the distinctions and the differences of how it's, better or how more present you are because you go through all that. So it's all like part of the learning process, I think. Just, yeah.
I want to speak to both the practices, all of them, and then the idea of having to have the knowledge in order to do it. Also, again, from personal experience. So we at the Stoa After Socrates don't have time to go through all the practices. And I do notice the difference in those dialectic, which does sometimes turn into dialogos that we do, and then the dialectic into dialogos, which we get to at the end of these weekends that you have. Because in those weekends, you do take time to go through all the practices. And so the depth that you get to when you do build up, and it's like a spiritual high almost that you get to when you do the whole weekend instead of just like an hour and a half. So there is very much benefit indeed to do all the practices, but there's also something called like reality and time constraints. So that makes it difficult sometimes. And then speaking to do you have to know kenosis and henosis and all those things? The first weekend that I did, it was the first weekend ever. And John did this meditation on phusis and kenosis and henosis and everything. And I was completely like, what the hell is he talking about? So I was completely, and I didn't understand anything that I was doing, but still it was incredibly enriching and deepening. So definitely I would advise people not to think that they have to have the sufficient knowledge to be able to do these things. You can do it and experience real great benefit from it, even if you do not understand all the terms. And I have noticed John is more he explains more now when he he doesn't just throw the Greek term in there and then okay, now we all have to do that, although we have no idea what it means. So yeah, that's it.
So don't worry if you don't think you have enough experience or enough time. Take a leap of faith when you hear weird things happening and just kind of trust the process. And also, the more prep you do put in, it has a meaningful outcome in relationship to your experience on average or something like that.
Both the depth and the height that you reach, if you do all the practices, is next level compared to if you only do an hour and a half. But yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate what you said, Lizelle, about the terminology, because terminology can be a real, it can be tough. And I would say that, part of the reason that John keeps to those terms is, it's not so that everyone who's doing the practice can, memorize them and understand their meaning and understand their etymology like that. That really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. I think the reason it keeps these terms in their original Greek is because they don't translate very easily, and any translation will refract the meaning. It will sort of boil it down to something that it's not quite, or it'll be taken in the wrong way. And if use a word that someone's already familiar with, especially in a practice like this, then someone reverts to that thing that is familiar.
Mm.
And so that's why these terms, I know it can seem pretentious, sometimes to people. And I get that. I really do get that. But the reason that they're untranslated is so that they can take on a meaning that is not already contaminated by the other meanings that someone is bringing in. And if all you understand by phusis is the description of what you're doing when you notice certain sensations, that's fine. Like that can be the limit of what you understand about that term, and it makes not one iota of difference. Understanding to use the P's, the propositional meaning of these terms is really it's a complement for those who want to go there, but it's incidental, really, for the practice itself. Yeah.
And that's true overarchingly in all of these philosophical activities. Is they're very intimidating to a lot of people because they don't have like a bachelor's in philosophy, or like they don't understand the Greek, and they go like, oh, I should be more technically proficient than I feel like I am because of all this stuff flying around. And I think like Lizelle's attitude is perfect, right? Just jump in, don't worry if they don't make perfect sense, because it's more of the bigger picture of participating in the practice that matters. And if you are into these, you can always learn more. Like for some people that love the technical aspect of things, they can learn about like the Sephiroths in Judaism and the Kabbalah and how that maps on to the Arabic levels of reality that Ibn Arabi put forward, et cetera, and get really, really deep into this. And that's wonderful for those people. But for just everybody, the practice has aspects that are valuable. The word philosophy isn't just like locked into undergraduate classrooms. It's actually allowed to be out in the rest of society where it was born, and when it was answering kind of religious questions and aspirational questions and actual philosophical kind of questions. So I like that all of that's been coming up. So kind of switching, and again, Taylor, I feel like you're probably the guru of this part, but now switching to like the philia practices, and anyone can kind of see those in the videos. And so there's like the noticing, the curiosity, maybe say what they are. And then again, like if someone's never done them, any tips or things to avoid, and then maybe we can open up from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think so noticing is generally, at least I consider it, and it's pretty fundamental in AR practice. We just ran an intro night last night, and it was one of the first things that we did. It's like primordial to relating. But the noticing practice, yeah, you're just back and forth with a partner, just trying to bring expression to your experience, your present moment experience, while being with somebody, rather than like verbal noting in a meditation or something, right? You're actually doing it with somebody. You're revealing to them something about your experience. So it sort of starts, I think it starts that, through the mutual disclosure, it starts the reciprocal opening, that puts, that's sort of the asana to put us into entering into sort of a brotherhood fellowship, the philia aspect of it. In terms of like tips for it or something like that, yeah, I don't know. It's almost like bringing those on suggests that it's a more complex practice than it really is. Like you can just notice wondering whether or not you forgot to close the garage door before you left, because that's what's here and now for you right now. You can add more complexity to it. You can start to sort of become aware in your cognition of what you're aware of. And then you could also like do a redo on it. Like, oh, what's underneath that? Like you can, so you can actually like go to a more of a depth of your experience, in terms of like an advanced move. But in terms of, accessible, general public new to practice, just naming like, oh, I notice my butt feels really sore. The floor is hard, and that's just like getting comfortable with like I feel something, or there's this impact, and bringing language to it so that you can communicate it with the other person. It's this effort to get shared reality, right? When I share something about my experience, now you know something about what's happening for me right now, and then you share it, and now I know what's happening for you right now. And it's just this ever evolving sort of beginnings of a relationship, opening up the lines of communication about, our subjective experiences. So yeah, I mean, that's what I would say about noticing anyways.
I have a question. So I remember when I was actually doing these practices for the first time during those weekends, I was very nervous because I felt like I have to get it right. And I was very nervous about noticing something and then either offending them or that they will say, no, you're wrong. So can you speak to that? Like, because to ease people's minds on that.
Well, so, I definitely wasn't there to do whatever potential variation of the practice that you did, but the way that you articulate it suggests, you might have been doing a slightly different practice. So when we're noticing, we can sort of notice things about our own subjective experience. And when we speak to them, nobody should be in disagreement with it because I'm the authority on my experience. However, there is an element to noticing where we can notice an objective observation about the other person. And sometimes if we don't quite get what we mean by objective, like something a camera would capture, and we try like a subjective observation, like, being with you, Lizelle, I noticed you were covering your mouth. And so actually I wouldn't say that, but I would say, like, hearing that, I notice you're shy right now, or you're feeling shy. And I have no idea that she's feeling shy. So there's certainly that piece that, if you're not using the objective observation, there's that risk of projection or putting something or asserting something on somebody else. But this idea of objective observation and sticking to our subjective experience, if we stick to it, there should be nothing that's coming up that can be debated, like it's, like my eyes aren't deceiving me, you're outdoors right now, and a camera is capturing that, right? But, I could make some sort of judgment of where in the world you are, and, oh, you're in Chicago or something. And I actually don't know that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So in terms of noticing, generally, if you're sticking to the actual exercise and that practice, that shouldn't necessarily come up. But there are other exercises where we start to offer things like stories we might have about the other person's experience. And that's where there can be that often that feeling of people feeling like concerned about the impact that they're having, like maybe they're too penetrative, or maybe they're putting something on somebody and, that has them hold back and start to filter. But with noticing, one of the reasons it's primordial is there's really isn't much to filter. I mean, maybe you have an attraction with the person who's in front of you. You might filter that because it doesn't feel appropriate. You have to navigate the agent-arena relationship a little bit here and there and decide what's the thing to share. Or
am I blinking too much when I look at you, Taylor? Is that how you can tell right now, or what am I doing?
Yeah, well, see, I would just, in noticing, I would just say, I notice you're blinking a lot. Or I notice I'm really curious about the way you're looking at me right now. It's like taking real ownership for it and not really putting it on somebody else. I mean, you might have a reaction to hearing it, like, oh my God, he oh my God, he sees that I like him or something like that. That might happen, but that's more, that's less about me and anything that I shared in the practice, and more just about the relationship and how we are in relationship. That nervousness, that, there's nothing, a mentor of mine, Diane Musho Hamilton, I think it's her, said there's nothing more threatening than another person. So there's all sorts of things that sort of come up for us in relationship that create these stories and concerns and anxieties and things like that.
Any other tips if someone is like shy or never done it or intimidated by some other aspect? And
yeah, I mean, maybe in some ways I'm not the right person to ask that. Maybe it should be somebody who's a little bit more introverted than I am, although I think I've turned more introverted these days than I used to be. I think, sometimes eye contact, if you're doing it in person, can be a little intense, so maybe allow yourself to lower your gaze, rather than like, oh, I have to be looking at them when I say this, but that could be the thing, like I notice it's a bit too intense to hold eye contact with you. And that's the thing that you notice, right? So then, in that, it gives you some permission, I suppose. You always have permission, you're an autonomous agent. But by saying that, and sticking to the structure of the exercise, then, there's that shared reality that might make it easier for you to lower your gaze and not stare into the other person's eyes and like hold your body tight because you think that's what needs to be done because you see everybody else doing that, So yeah, the best thing that I can sort of say is honor yourself. It's usually our first agreement in authentic relating practice. Don't do or say anything that you don't want to. If you need to step out or step away, if it's too much, do that. And it's something about like giving yourself that permission might lower some of the anxiety. Also some permission to fuck it up. We have this shared context, that we're here to do this practice, which is very different than when you're talking to the bank teller or the checkout cashier lady. So there's something about having that shared context. It's like, right, this is the dojo, this is the gym, we're here practicing, but we're all here practicing, so there's a bit more of allowance to sit with the awkwardness or be with the awkwardness of screwing up together. Yeah, that's the best that I can sort of think of.
I think it's, from my experience, it can be very tough for people, especially for we introverts, to avoid the impulse to want to perform, put on a mask, or assume a particular, like it's really hard to avoid because it happens for some people. It happens so instinctively. You don't even know that you're doing it. You're just doing it, right? You're noticing, but you immediately have already selected the number of things that are pertinent to notice. And you've already selected out the thing that is probably most real underneath the noticing, which is the discomfort with the whole process. Mm-hmm. It's really hard. I'll speak from my own experience. I find that tremendously difficult, still do, to get to pause and to get underneath whatever it is that frame is created. I know for me, and I think for a lot of other people, it's created so automatically, the selection menu of things that you can say. Mm-hmm. And then you have to consciously remind yourself or be reminded that menu is really abbreviated. Like it's a false menu, and it's a menu that is designed and adapted to other contexts in life, not this one. Incidentally, this goes back to the meditation, this goes back to why some of these practices are mutually complementary, because they help to break down those frames. But I know that's something I struggle with, and I imagine a lot of other people do, which is, what do you notice? And you say it, and then you realize afterwards that was not the truest thing at all. Mm-hmm. I just said that because I just assumed it was the thing to say. It's tough. It's a hard lesson. But it's kind of helpful to have those moments of insight. You go, oh, right, I see. I was playing a game I didn't know I was playing, and it was actually the wrong game for the moment,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, that's how we learn, right?
Yeah.
That's the, yeah, it's just like the willingness to lean in and try it is sometimes all that's needed. And you'll know, I mean, unless you're really, really committed to deceiving yourself, you'll know that it's like, oh, hang on, that wasn't right. And that's how it just occurs to me how we learn. So yeah, that's why it's the dojo, right? It's the place to come to practice. Yeah,
that's right.
Anything else, Lizelle, that you want to add there to this kind of idea?
There's thoughts, but it's very unworded as yet. But it's something about, I think what made me so uncomfortable in those rooms that I'm now remembering was indeed the fact that I was wearing a mask and I was playing a role that was inappropriate for that context. Mm-hmm. And that was why I was a bit stressed, because something in me noticed like,
well, that brings up for me one thing that you can sort of do as a facilitator, that the two of you could do in the next session or something to help people with that, is you do it's hard to call this an exercise, but you get them to break their mask. So you just get them to put their hands on their face and just start in front of people, just start mangling your face so it looks so weird and awkward, you know. And it's amazing sort of how through doing that, it actually, like, there's that touch piece, you know, it helps sort of reset in some ways. It's just like that willingness to be really weird and ugly in front of you often can break that mask. I've certainly experienced that a number of times through that.
Yeah, when someone can demonstrate that to the group, like through enacting it, it can be very powerful. Even if it doesn't happen in like that event, if the same group gets back together in the future, it tends to, I think, open up the inhibitions of the group when someone's kind of brave. Like John would one time we were practicing with like 12 or 15 people. I think you were there, Lizelle, for some of these. And people would just freeze because John would say, like, speak to the author, not to the text. And people are like, what? They're dead. This Aristotle is dead, John. How can I talk to Aristotle? And then like someone like layman Pascal will go, Aristotle, I'm pulling on your beard. I'm trying to listen to your weird ears, your Greek wrinkly ears. And then all of a sudden you go, oh yeah, this is serious play. I can actually transcend my kind of egoic, super egoic role that I'm usually playing. And the more kind of comfortable you are with that play, and especially when you're in a group that also is encouraging of that kind of play, then all of a sudden you can get much deeper into practice. So I remember one time Guy Sengstock said, like, just be embarrassed as much as possible. And I was like, I want to be embarrassed. And I like kind of carried that with me. And it was so helpful because we freeze to things that would embarrass us so unconsciously and quickly that we don't notice it. And when you can kind of embarrass you, like I love that smushy face thing that you were doing, Taylor, because if you can kind of be a little, then it opens up that kind of playful courage for the practice, which the practice really thrives on. And also, just while you all were talking, I thought it was interesting too that whenever I feel like I'm starting to plan what I'm going to say next, I try to catch myself and throw myself back into like deep listening and reflecting on what happened like 2 minutes ago, or just getting out of my own perspective. And that also like really, really helps the practice, because that automatic, like, oh, I can pontificate on, you know, whatever vanity or whatever virtue we're talking about or vice we're talking about. And as soon as that automaticity happens, you're in danger of like just repeating what you've learned in some class or something. So, and then I guess the last question, I guess is very open, but Taylor, maybe particularly, like how long, if it's just 4 people that meet up once a month or once a week or that I've never met, is like a good amount of this kind of interpersonal lubrication that's trying to build this Sophia? Like, is it like ever better? Like, what's the range that's like a healthy heuristic, I guess?
I guess I would have to say, like, what's sort of is there an ongoing container? Is sort of this thing of
Let's say both. Like if it's just one off or if it is a group.
Yeah, I'll use an example. I just started a 4-week circling series, and the first session we ran a bit longer so that we had a bit more time to go through some of the introductory practices. But, you know, a lot of that thing is sort of, again, like the wading in and people getting used to starting to relate to this particular group so that they can have a bit of that opening. But we're meeting once a week. So I just did a session, that's what I was coming back from. And I didn't have us do as much philia building as we would have, because we have that past experience of being together. So we have already a bit of a shared context. Like we already get a sense of what we're buying into now, because we just did it, you know, a week ago. But I still want, again, you know, to do the meditation, to do like a little, like, you know, meet this person, you know, share a couple of things with them, meet this person, like a bit of an acclimatization to the space. So I'll still do a little bit, you know, we'll do like 2 rounds of noticing. We'll take maybe 10 minutes. Whereas in the first session, you know, first 45, 50 minutes of that entire session is sort of building up these experiences with the different people that are in a group, trying to make sure that you can, you know, if you're going to do pair stuff, that everybody sort of gets to meet each other. And that just, you know, in my experience, it tends to engender trust, and, you know, people get relaxed and are more apt to, you know, be more vulnerable, be on the edge of their thinking, those sorts of things. So yeah, I think if you've already have a shared context and your group is committed and consistent, I wouldn't necessarily say that you would go through the gauntlet of warm-ups that are available to you necessarily. But, you know, you sort of have to feel into that in terms of the capacity of the group, and, you know, how good of a facilitator you are, because I think I heard maybe Christopher naming this earlier, but, you know, in this example, as we get into dialectic, into Dialogos, you know, like, it's a very, very structured practice, and the structure offers a bunch of affordances through these various constraints of these roles. So there's a way in, like, just engaging, jumping into the practice also already puts us into particular positions and asanas to do the practice well. But we still want to make sure, you know, if we're at the gym, we do a warm up, because, you know, you might do that one heavy, too much lift, and it tweaks your shoulder and you're screwed because you didn't do the warm up, right? So I would still encourage to do something, you know, but also, like, trust your experience. You know, if you're like, you know, how are we doing? Does anybody feel like they need more to be more here with everyone? You know, and if somebody's like, yeah, maybe we could do another one or another two, and, you know, just lean into that and trust what's the feedback you're getting from the group. Yeah, I guess that's what I would say about that.
Awesome, that makes a lot of sense. All right, so now we'll go to the fellowship practice first. So yeah, I don't know, would one of the three of you like to just describe philosophical fellowship as you see it? I think it's a fun practice, but how do you three see it?
So I can begin a little bit just to say, philosophical fellowship as a technique or as a practice it's adapted. It's sort of, it has a lot of different, it has a few different origins, but I mean, it fundamentally is a kind of a form of communal Lectio Divina. It's not Lectio Divina technically, but it's sort of in the same family. And it was adapted specifically by John from a practice, philosophical companionship, which was Ron Lahav's practice. So more technically and more specifically, the origin is in that adaptation. And I see fellowship as sort of bridging between the authentic relating exercises and the contemplation exercise and the dialectic and dialogos exercise, because it's what it's doing is it's taking that capacity to relate and relate sensibly, right? Meaning, you know, sort of taking the noticing that we apply to an individual across from us, whose expressions we can see and whose face we can read to a point, and whose body we can read. And we're taking a lot of the same capacity and we're applying it to reading text, right? So we're trying to take, in other words, a sort of a perspectival or participatory, an embodied way of relating that comes with the philia practices. And we're trying to embed an embodied way of relating into a text, into a literary medium, which is very counterintuitive to all of us, because we're used to reading. We read in such a way that that reading for us, we're accustomed to it being a very sort of cerebral exercise, and what we extract from our reading is often very propositional. And what we're trying to do in philosophical fellowship is we're trying to kind of poeticize our experience of a text so that we're actually living in it. We're submerging ourselves in it. And we're creating from the text a kind of a body that we can share together, a body that we can, right? Imagine the text is the person across from you. The text is a body, and it's a body that you can build philia with. And in building philia with the body, you see yourself reflected back in the embodied expressions and the movements of that text as though it were flesh and blood. And I think that's what we mean. You know, people get really caught, and you made reference to this, Robert, earlier. people get really caught in the idea that we're somehow trying to talk to the author. I'm starting to think that we actually need to change the way that we talk about that a little bit, because I think people really get caught in that because they keep thinking of the author as a historical person.
Right.
And the author, I think it's still a bit of an open question as to exactly how to calibrate the sort of the settings. It's the language of explanation and training business, right? I'm still not 100% sure how we calibrate those settings, because we do sometimes give a bit of a primer of who this author was and what their significance was and what their role was perhaps within philosophy, although we could just as easily use other kinds of writers. It doesn't have to be philosophers, can be poets and whatnot, right? Who might not have a cataloged series of ideas that they've contributed to the lexicon. So there's no necessity to give that kind of background. We do sometimes, though. I still wonder about the merits of that, but that's an aside. It's a very open question for me. But I think fundamentally what we mean when we're talking to the author is that we're talking to the body that we find in the text when we sink into it and begin to see it and feel our way through it as we would a person whose expressivity is something that is unfolding as we encounter it. And we find ourselves spoken in a text as we find ourselves speaking back to it, so that there is, again, in the language that John often uses, it's this reciprocal opening, a disclosure of the passage and its plethora of possible meanings. And our disclosure and the plethora of possible meanings that come out of us when we're stretched and drawn out and trying to explain what's sitting on our chest that might not be conscious to us. So it's using a kind of, it's almost a kind of liturgical repetition to try and dislodge us from that propositional way of reading into a more embodied, a more sensuous way of reading, right? To find the eros in the reading again. And, I trust you'll take that in the spirit it's intended, right? It's about developing an intimacy with what is that there's an act. The text is an act, right? That there's a movement in it, that there's intention in it, that there's something is being conveyed beneath the words, between them, right? Around them. And just as when a person speaks to us, and this comes into play really significantly in Dialectic and Dialogos, right? When I'm making the proposal, I say this, but I mean this, right? Because language, it's tough. It's tough business, language, right? I say this and I mean this. And I think what philosophical fellowship is trying to get us to do within a text, within a literary form, is understand that the text is this and its meaning is this. And out from there, right? We can't find the boundaries or limits of that meaning. That's the point, is the conveyance and the intent and what is being intimated by it is exceedingly greater than anything that could be summarized in the letter of what it says. And that the philosophical fellowship is a way of using the relationship we have now that's been developing with one another and using the kind of collective or compounding rationality, I guess you could say, that we have as a group, and using the relation between one another to develop a deeper relationship with the text such that we sink into the body of it together and feel what it is to live in it, right? I mean, it's the way John often talks about it, right? It's like getting inside the perspective of the text, knowing through it. Again, that's why the contemplation is helpful for this too, in the meditation, right? Because it's the transparency, opacity shifting that I was talking about, right? So whereas in meditation, you're trying to do the transparency to opacity, and just like in the contemplation, in the philosophical fellowship, you're trying to take the opaque text and turn it transparent and wear it so that you know by means of it. Anyway, sorry guys, that was a bit long. But I think that's the core of it. That's the spirit of it as a practice.
Yeah, no, I love that. I'm also aware that my first time ever doing actually, No, it's not my only time. I did it with you guys on the Stoa, but my first time doing philosophical fellowship was in the recording of episode 10. I had not done it before, but it occurs to me, sort of going back to that questioning of the author and speaking to the author, and maybe you can say more about this, Christopher, having a pretty good sense of its intent. I get the sense that this is sort of like I don't even know if I would call it a precursor, but it's sort of this move to internalize the sage. It occurs to me as like an imaginal act, but I don't know that it's necessarily set up that way. I'm trying to remember now the setup for the philosophical fellowship, whether or not it actually speaks directly to the idea of, this is an imaginal aspect of the practice. And in that, it occurs to me, to whatever degree that's true, that it makes sense to get a little bit of background history, because I start to think of like my generalized frame of the other, going back from the elusive I, and it's like, oh, this information helps fill in some of the gaps, and then I'm going to imaginally also fill in the other ones based on my capacity and pattern matching and everything else, and then yeah, it just feels like that sense of, because we're never going to get it comprehensive, we'll just never, maybe somebody who studies it, a person, an academic, they might get close, but even then, those guys are usually in an argument over, what that person meant when they said X, Y, or Z anyway. So, you're never going to fully get that person, but it feels like, if you can do that, if you can internalize them, you can sort of befriend them. If you can do that with Socrates, then Socrates is your wingman sort of idea, like the more and more that you can do that, So I wonder to what degree that's a conscious piece, or if it's just like a great, I don't know, feature, I know a hidden feature of that practice. Or
That's a really good point. So what I'm hearing you say is like, no, the merit of giving sort of a brief biographical profile, biological profile, a brief biographical profile of a person is kind of acts as a selective constraint in your capacity to internalize their model.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that, if your imagination of them is so open-ended that it could encompass like an innumerable, it becomes combinatorially explosive, I guess, right, to use that language. And then, but if you have a certain boundary that you're working within, that actually helps to gather together a model of the author and the text that's not so illimitable that it can be anything, and you can just end up wandering through possibilities and never get a purchase on it.
Mm-hmm.
But so it keeps it constrained enough that you can actually have something to internalize that is other than you, so that you don't simply extend yourself projectively into them. Is that kind of what you're getting at, Taylor? Yeah, that's very clever. I like that. That's really good. And so actually that really speaks to why that component is important. And I think you're right. I think it is an imaginal exercise. Like, I think, we often, maybe a lot of people are used to thinking of imaginal exercises as involving a component, a heavy component of visualization or something like that. But I don't think that's necessary. Mm-hmm. For an exercise to be imaginal. And I think that this definitely qualifies as one. The other thing I think about this exercise, and John will have to forgive me for this remark, but I think that there's of all of these exercises, my sense is that philosophical fellowship is the one that probably has the most flexibility to being adapted in different ways. So for instance, I've had people report to me that they have done the exercise in variation. So they've, instead of, before a specific passage or before a specific line is selected out of a passage, they'll have every single person read the entire passage, or they'll increase the number of repetitions as they go around the circle. Or, they'll, in the short speech, it'll be, one line instead of a maximum of 3. Things like, there are ways of, these boundaries that are put in the letter and the instructions of the practices are there in such a way to give it shape. But I think that there's a little bit of flex. And I think that, especially because it's an imaginal exercise, I think that there is room for it to be adapted to the particular needs or the particular traits or the particular combination of people that are actually undertaking it. For instance, right, when in the engaged speech, the letter of the instructions, as we've been using them, says, to recount a short story about yourself, right? But, really it means that you're deepening the relationship between yourself and between the text. Now, does that have to come in terms of an anecdote or a story? Not necessarily, right? So the idea is that it's the spirit or the intended purpose of each of these stages rather than exactly what is prescribed. I think that's really important. Yeah. I'll leave it there for the moment. I do any of you have any other thoughts about this or questions about this?
I always like the part where people say why they picked someone when they sincerely mean it. I could feel that. So when someone's like, "Oh, I brought Nishitani today and I'm so excited," and I can feel that, then it sparks that a little bit in me, especially if I've just been meditating and I've just been circling and doing all that, and then I feel someone's enthusiasm, because like I really do get giddy for Socrates and Plato, and I've spent too much time caring about Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. So sometimes when I bring some of their works, I'm like really looking forward to it. Or if I've maybe like tailored it to a group and thought, oh, I really want this group to feel like wonder or courage or sincerity or whatever, like, because there's so many like types of flavors of philosophers and thinkers. You can go with like heavy feminist, heavy ethics, heavy creativity, heavy one, like there's so many different types of flavors of sage that when I say, oh, I'm really excited about Simone Weil because she just blows my mind, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I've seen people react to my excitement with excitement because of the sincerity of it. So I think that part of it starts, because I remember when John used to quote like reverence and respect. He would say it all the time for like a few months of when he was doing stuff. And I'm like, oh yeah, reverence and respect. And I feel like that part of the practice really can evoke reverence for the sage or respect for the passage. And yeah, it's very imaginal. It's very aspirational because you're picking Buber because of the way that that passage struck you, and you're hoping it strikes you twice or strikes the group. So I think there's I've seen both, but I always feel like when someone is into the person or the passage and they share it, like John did that with me when I first started doing the fellowship practice in particular, and I would really listen, and I was like, oh, why is he picking Nicholas Akuza? Who is this weirdo? No one cares about. But then John would say, I'm picking him because of A, B, and C, and I'm like, oh, that's cool. That's already opening me up perspectively to like the wonder within that person.
I wonder, Robert, is part of that because you also like in your example, because you care for John or something?
Both, like, but I always care for who I'm practicing with, because I think the reason Rand Lahav called it like friendship and John debated with like fellowship and friendship is because there is such a thing as fellowship. And when I show up to practice fellowship, I want to love you. I want to like you've descended from the one. So I've already got a reason to love you, and we're in fellowship and we practice. So to me, like all of that is all kind of harmonizing in this spirit of philia, in the spirit of fellowship, for sure.
Yeah, that's cool. This idea that one person makes the introduction. It's like when you bring a person into your, you here's the guest of honor at dinner tonight. And I'm bringing the guest of honor, and everyone's trust in me, if it's been earned by all of these exercises, or if it's just been earned, out in the wild, as you might say, Lizelle, then that trust is going to be that I'm going to be the transitive property. The trust is going to be conferred from me onto the person I bring. They're going to have a positive forbearance with that person. And you have to have that. You have to have that in this practice. You have to reach for what is intimated rather than what is said, right? Just as you do when you circle, just as you do in dialectic and dialogos. You must reach for what is meant and said and felt rather than what is meant and intimated and felt rather than what is said. And there is quite a bit of paradox in trying to do that when your only thing to interact with is a text. And it is precisely that tension, or tonos, as we might say, that makes the practice what it is, and that requires the imaginal projection to bring it to life.
I like it.
Philosophical, sorry.
Please go
Yeah.
ahead.
It comes pretty easy to me. Most of my lovers are between covers and book covers, not sheets. So I'm used to that type of relationship with words. But I think what you mentioned makes a lot of sense, because when you were talking about should you introduce the author or not, I was actually hesitant, because I have experienced that people would tell me afterwards, like they come in with a certain perspective of the author, and then that clouded the whole practice for them. They had this one negative thing about the author in the mind, and that the whole. So, but actually, then Taylor, what you and Christopher and Robert then all three mentioned is, if someone comes in and say, but this is how I know this author, so let's look at the author in this way, like this, and see the author in this way, and focus on this during the practice. That would help also that with people who do come in with a lot of knowledge of the author, but not necessarily positive knowledge. It would also eliminate that. It will also help them to learn how to know how to look at the text then through a different lens. So yeah. So indeed, being introduced by someone trustworthy, or that does have the trust of the group, is important.
Oh, what a great way of connecting it all back, Lizelle. That's great. So what you're saying is that the introduction, the way of framing the profile of the author is best if it's framed as a relationship with the person who is hosting them. And instead of saying, here is who this author was, here's what Wikipedia says, it's more like, here is my encounter and my relationship with this person. It doesn't matter who they are objectively, right? Because that would be completely besides the point. Here's who they are to me, and I'm introducing them via their relationship with me. And it is in that way that you are going to come first to know them before getting to know them each on your own terms. And that's a wonderful way of both sort of solving the problem that you and I think, have both wondered about, which is, how do you avoid contaminating a person's ability to encounter the text? But Taylor's point of, but hang on, like you can't just allow people to imagine this person as whomever they want them to be. Right? That's not a sufficient constraint. And that also means that you're not introducing a sense of you're not distinguishing the identities properly. And I think your proposal is a really elegant way of somehow doing both at once,
and bringing in Robert's enthusiasm, because we love the person who introduced us to this author. We also automatically then get enthusiastic about them.
Well, that's what I was going to say, Lizelle. I know you'll love this. So I was talking to John a couple of days ago, and I was like, episode 17, Christopher Mastropietro made me fall in love with this Kierkegaard fellow. I always found him very kind of morose and too pessimistic, and it always felt like the aesthetic and the ethical, he's always like leaning more to the ethical than I prefer. I wish he was a little more. And then all of a sudden, you're like, you love this guy. I could feel your respect and admiration and this intimacy. You struggled with this fellow, over years of your life. And then I go, oh, I want to re-examine the way I'm viewing that because of how I'm seeing him view that. And that eros is actually seducing me into desiring to know more about this character. And I'm just gushing. I'm like, John, your friend is so beautiful. The way he talks about this Kierkegaard fellow. I've read many of his books. I've skimmed through many. They bore me, and now I'm like clearing my weekend to reread his books because of the respect and that intimacy that was built between kind of the proposer and the work that they're proposing. So I figured Lizelle would appreciate that story at least, and maybe embarrass Christopher a little bit. But
I want to embarrass Christopher further. Like everyone at the Stoa After Socrates is completely into Kierkegaard at this stage, and it's because they're watching After Socrates. So you are very much bringing your man to the hearts of the people. So,
well, yeah. I'm just incredibly touched by that. I am as touched as I am embarrassed. At least, thank you. That I'm really moved to hear that.
But there is a persuasive innocence when people are really excited about a philosopher, especially for the right reasons, because they like inspired them somehow. That I think is kind of cool about that part of the practice.
Robert, I want to check something about that. I wonder if it occurs to you, or you'd be comfortable saying that, you know, you did use this word, but not necessarily in this way. Is it that your experience of, you know, using this example of Christopher talking about Kierkegaard, you're seeing beauty and you are just drawn to the beautiful? It like has
explicitly 100%.
Yeah.
There's
something about people maybe bringing in that enthusiasm, you know, maybe the thing that draws us into it or opens us up to the possibility of you know, how they're relating to it, is we're sensing some beauty in how they're coming with it, you know, like the energy and the, you know, the excitement about it. And it's like, oh, you know, like it opens up possibilities in some way.
Yeah, because there's this very modern move of being cynically detached from opinions. And the opposite move is to be sincere in your metaphysics, for lack of a better word. And if you sincerely, you just go, oh, I saw beauty shine through, I don't care what the world thinks, then people notice that. And it's contagious. It's got like the social contagion to be a little kind of scientific about it. And the eros of the practice, I think, is again, Plato does this so well, right? I would go on a tangent and just start ranting about how smart Plato is for not being this kind of like detached lover of wisdom. He's this erotic lover of wisdom, and there's something about seeing someone's excitement or respect or anticipation that I think I mean, it even catches me, like when Lizelle and I are doing this at the Stoa, and I see people come out of the breakout rooms and they're glowing. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. I think I've heard you, Taylor, say, like, I every time I do this practice, I'm re-surprised by how awesome it is. So I think part of that is the Tau erotica of the beauty of the practice, for sure.
Yeah.
So the rest of the steps, just to kind of finish with that practice, are more direct, precious speaking or short speech or whatever the kind of current moniker for that step is, where you try to speak in a constrained way to where you're really trying to express whatever you're expressing in a very constrained way. And then the engaged speech, where it opens up, and the free speech. So I guess out of those steps, the rest, is there any tips or confusing parts when you've administered these things, or just other points that can help people get the most out of that? Because I think we've really explored a lot of good stuff in this practice.
I think the short speech gets people very confused. And I think it gets people confused because I think people get a little hung up on, like when we give the instructions for this, usually we say, you know, no more than 3 sentences or something like that, you know. And I think people latch onto that and they're like, oh, okay. They're trying to calculate how long their speech is, and like as you say, they're also thinking ahead to what they're going to say, and they're not listening. That's a really tough one. Engaged speech, I think, is in some sense, is a little easier, even though there's more volume to it, because you have time to kind of unpack a thought and follow it, and you can meander a little bit more in your own speech and thinking. But if you have to say something pithily and quickly, you're sort of like, oh, how do I craft the perfect thing to say? And people get very hung up on that. And I think, so one way of thinking about that is, I've taken to saying, instead of, say a few lines, just, it's a single thought, right? It's a single impression. It's like whatever it is that surfaces in you, right? Whatever it is that the short speech is the reaction, right? It's your immediate confrontation. And initially it becomes the confrontation with the text, but then as it goes around, it becomes your confrontation with whatever is building within the group, right? Because if you're listening, your short speech ends up responding to the other short speech. And the short speech and the rounds of short speech in their entirety are responding to the rounds of the text of the actual passage that you're reading. So it's all part of the same whole. It's all oriented in the same way. But I think that one way of thinking about the short speech is it is what surfaces most intuitively in your encounter with the exercise, in your encounter with the passage, and then in your encounter with the mounting or the gathering speech of the group. And so whether it ends up being one sentence or 3 or 4, it's not like, that's not material, right? Short, it's like saying, what's a moment? It's like, is a moment a minute? Is a moment 3 seconds? It's like, it's the concept of the brevity. It's not the letter of the brevity, right? And I think if people get through that, I think that the engaged speech becomes a lot easier, because then it just unspools everything that was happening in the short speech. But if everyone gets hung up on the short speech and gets a little bit too exacting about it, they lose the flow and they lose the purpose of the momentum. So I think that's often a crook.
I have a question, but maybe I'm becoming now too exacting and doing exactly what you say I shouldn't do. So, what is the intention, actually, the first round? Do everyone speak to the text or the first round, or do we automatically start speaking to the other people as well? So do I respond, my first round, do I respond to the text, or do I respond to the person who just spoke before me?
I think you're doing both. I think if you're listening to what is being said, I think you will end up doing both. And I don't think you need to, and I know how difficult this is. I don't mean to say it's easy to just sidestep that. But I think that the most important part of this is to listen not just to what each person is saying, but to listen to the rhythm. Mm-hmm. Right? This is more than any other practice. This is a musical exercise. And seeing this as a musical exercise is even more than Dialectic and Dialogos, I think. This is a very musical exercise. And if you listen to the rhythm and the flow, and the rhythm will be a direct consequence of the encounter with the passage. So if everyone is listening and reading attentively, then I don't think there will be a difference.
Because why I ask this, because sometimes something, to stay with the music theme, something sings in me to the text, but then someone says something which kind of makes it obsolete, or and then I will not know, can I still speak to the text? Can I still sing to the text what I wanted to sing, or should I rather join the melody of the group?
Okay, that's good. I see what you mean. Right. Okay, so you're giving a situation where actually the two seem to be actually there's a contrast, or there's something atonal.
Yeah.
Between the text and the person before you who is speaking.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, in keeping with the same musical extended metaphor, the atonality, I think, is also part of the exercise. So, I would say be faithful to what must be said, right? Be faithful to what you must say because of your encounter with the text. And even if that does not comport with what remember, this is not about propositional consistency at all. right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you have to throw out it neither. I would like, and I know it's tricky. It's part of conditioning the right kind of middle way of receptivity, right? It's not like, well, I have to throw out what was in me because of this person saying this particular thing. You don't. If it's there, then it's there. It must be said. But neither do I hold so fast to what I'm about to say that I lose the capacity to pick up on what others are saying. And it's that it's being porous enough to get a sense of the rhythm without being so exacting that you're trying to manage what you're holding and what you're giving. And that's a hard thing to prescribe. It's just something the repetition helps to wear down. I think one of the things I think one of the functions that the repetition is meant to have is it's meant to kind of just erode away the
False notes.
Yeah, right. It's meant to wear down a little bit of the fussiness that we all tend to get. Like I get it too, just as easily, of managing yourself and managing your speech so fastidiously, right? And I think one of the things that the repetition is very helpful for, and by the way, like I think you could very easily, like, this says 4 rounds. I kind of think you could go 8. I think you could go 16. I think you could go 30. Like, what would that mean if you went 30 rounds of this? Like, I don't know, but I actually feel like if you went 30 rounds of this, by the end of those 30 rounds, all of the preciousness would be gone. It would just be worn out, right? You just wouldn't give a shit anymore about what you were about to say. And then what was elicited would be much more instinctive, much more receptive. So I think that's where we're trying to get to.
I just want to point out, you said, stay faithful to what needs to be said. And that is exactly why this feels more like a spiritual, religious practice than a philosophical, academic practice. It's that sentiment of stay faithful to what needs to be said.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right.
And I think there's skillfulness to it too.
At all.
There's really, like, as you practice more, sometimes you're with a group where you really want to like feed one of the other people, and that will bring them into the group. And so playing with the group, like kneading dough, it brings the material together. Sometimes there's something like in me that I'm just going to express, because that it's like, it's so alive. It's right there. I've been listening. I'm not just in some autodidactic, like, here's how Nietzsche should sound to my group right now. But it's just something like, and that, like, the play of it, I think, is really, there's a whole skillfulness in that play, because sometimes the weird new notes that were like, you're uncertain to bring in, they'll create this kind of playfulness that'll ripple through the practice. And sometimes it really, if you don't get enough of that cohesion, it can also be kind of awkward. So I think there's not a wrong like move to do there, as much as like it's kind of like an intuitive, expressive act that you kind of decide by feeling what the group is doing. Because I'm always impressed when people surprise me with something they'll say that I was like, oh, that's really authentic to them. That's really so surprising that it had to have been really honest. And that creates a lot of fun. So I would never say like, don't do the thing that's calling to you, even if it feels awkward in your head. Yeah. Taylor, any other just kind of general thoughts about the different steps, or Lizelle as well?
I just want to point out, like, Robert is being very sincere there, because I've been in philosophical fellowship with him where he mooed. So
we sung, we've done like a lot of, like, one time Rick Rapetti sang like a whole song, and then like 2 days later he sang another song to us. So that spirit that emerged in the practice rippled through our personal relationships. So that riskiness and that vulnerability that can kind of be expressed when especially the group has some philia and some history, or is just really playful. I've also done this with total strangers, and like Cheryl Sue, for example, is so playful that even if she's never met the other three people in the group, that playful spirit will often erupt.
Yeah, that's good. That's beautiful. Yeah. And that's a very, very good reason why, what you have to be faithful to whatever it is that is trying to be said, because in giving, also as soon as you give it, you've kind of been relieved of it, right? It's like, there, it's out of my system, right? As opposed to, okay, there's this thing I'm holding fast to and I need to find the right moment to say, it's like, no, get it out. And then who knows what's next? That's the point, right? Who knows what's coming next once you get that thing out that you're holding, as though it's some kind of gem, right? Just get it out and see what happens. Yeah. Beautiful. You guys are full of insights about this. It's really, I feel like I understand it better now even than I did an hour ago.
I love it. Any other comments about the fellowship? And maybe we'll move to the dialectic practice, if not. Sweet. So then the dialectic practice is our last agenda item. So yeah, maybe Taylor or Lizelle, you want to take the courage to describe what dialectic into Dialogos is, since Christopher bravely did the last one.
Wow. Well, the funny thing about it is I tend to talk about it in the context of a number of other things. I don't think I've ever really had to try to introduce it, outside of the context of certain pieces. Yeah, there's like a way in which, I feel like shy or something, like, I want to do it justice in some way. There's sort of like relating to, yeah, this is a thing I want to talk to John about at some point. It's like this practice to me refers to a process, and the process is dialectic into Dialogos, and yet it's also the name of the practice. So to me, there are other dialectic into Dialogos practices because they go through this process. But I remember with this particular practice, the first couple of times I did it, I did not particularly like it. It felt extremely constraining, which is very, very different than what I'm used to with, a very emergent practice like circling. We're sort of always looking to the horizon of what's here together. But I actually, over time, and John's articulation and context setting for it got tighter, and then especially when the two new roles got added, which will be news to a lot of people, because my understanding is, Christopher, you guys have not actually brought those two roles into one of the live weekends yet.
The most recent one we did.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but they are relatively recent. You're right.
Yeah. So for me, this practice is this attempt for us to move from a dialectic, hopefully, into Dialogos. To me, it's almost always going to be a dialectic, and the Dialogos is always there, but it might not catch fire. We might not notice it. We might not commune with it. But I see the practice as this series of constraints that afford us this opportunity to do dialectic, even if we don't necessarily know what dialectic is. And I see it as sort of the incorporation of humble wonder and learned ignorance. It's really, if you have a capacity to do it, it's going to enhance your experience. And if you don't, it's going to start building that capacity. So I've come to really appreciate the structure of dialectic into Dialogos. So with that, the way that it tends to be done, although I've experimented with a vice once, but the way it tends to be done is that the group, chooses a virtue. And what ends up happening is we have these four roles. We have the proposer, we have the listener / amplifier, we have the scribe, and we have the herald, these four roles. So it's done in groups of four generally. I've done it in groups of three where you combine the scribe and the herald. It's preferable to do it in four, but it's not impossible to do it with three. And, we step into these different roles, and they're very, very distinct roles. So, for me, the proposer, they're sort of calling on to, or the way it occurs to me is you're calling on to your relationship to a degree of the virtue. It's like this humble wonder of knowing and not knowing. Like, you might know what the textbook definition of it is, but that's not what we're bringing forward. We're not bringing forward the textbook definition. We're bringing forward more like a emergent knowing of it in this moment, right here, right now. This is what feels like needs to be said about humility or something, right? And this is what gets brought forward. And the role of the listener, of the amplifier, is to amplify the proposal. I actually tend to look at that role as the midwife. This is very much the midwifing role. This is like, I'm in it with you, honey. Like, yeah, what do you got on humility? Yeah, okay, yeah, no, that's good, and it's like this. Okay, great. Yeah, what else you got? Like, I see it as a very supportive role. Like, I'm in here with you on this. There's like it doesn't have to be quite that comically encouraging, but it is that supportive midwifing, that that attempt to adduce out what else might be there. I think Christopher said, like, there's this, but it's this, so I'm trying to bring the language of the proposal, and it's like try to adduce it so that we get a little bit more of the this into the proposal. So that happens for a number of minutes. The scribe, of course, is tracking what's happening in the proposal, as you go through each of the steps, and the herald is tracking what is not being said. So, it might be like interpersonal dynamics or something like that, like the subtleties, body language, like a sense, maybe somewhere where they're noticing the virtue starting to show up in the dialectic between the proposer and the amplifier. And then the amplifier then actually has a couple other moves that they need to do. Then they can move into appreciation, where they start to appreciate something about the proposal, maybe where it spoke to them, what sings for them. And then because these roles will shift, because everybody will get a chance to play these roles, then the amplification, which moves into appreciation, then turns into anticipation, where they sort of start to contemplate maybe something that's not been said about the proposal, something that's maybe still mysterious to them. But it's sort of like this talking out loud. It occurs to me, it's like this talking out loud into the space, like, oh, I could like explore this aspect of it, or I could explore that aspect of it. But it's sort of like doing that like in real time, live, and then sort of settling on, I'm gonna, I think I'm gonna go in this direction, and then the role switch, and then the after that anticipation, that person then becomes the new proposer. And so, and we also obviously, of course, checking in before they become the proposer, actually before the appreciation, we go into, I forgot that, we go into checking in with the scribe to let us know what the evolution of the proposal has been. And then we check in with the herald to see what it is that they noticed, what they were observing within the dialectic. And then the amplification and anticipation happens. And then you do that 4 times. And then hopefully, so this whole process, I think as John talks about it, this is the gathering of the logs for the fire, and hopefully it will catch fire, but we can't like force it to catch fire. We can do our best to create all the conditions and to gather the logs. And hopefully throughout the process, somewhere in there, it starts to catch fire. And if it's caught fire, I mean, even if you don't know it is, you're gonna, go into some serious play with it regardless. And then after all 4 people have gone through all of the roles, you just sort of release that structure and move into, an open dialogue together, hopefully, because now the fire has caught, and there's, nothing left to do in terms of the structure, but to circle that fire, and to look at it from like different angles and like point out things that are like interesting to you around the fire. So it's sort of the way that it occurs to me. It's not necessarily the way I would set up the practice. But yeah, to me, that's how I relate to the practice. How it sort of occurs to me as a bit of a campfire and sort of almost like a ritual. I actually haven't thought of it as a ritual until now, but it's sort of like this ritual. calling the Dialogos forward such that we can actually, commune with it in some way. Because it's always there. It's just, can we see it? Can we call it forward? Can we touch it? Yeah. So that's what I would say. I encourage everybody or anybody else to fill in the gaps.
I just want to say, Taylor, if you were my listener and you responded to me like with that enthusiasm, like, go honey, I'm here, come, you can do this, then I would have definitely given birth to a virtue. So that's the spirit.
Mm-hmm.
I like that too.
That was a great account.
Yeah, because you were saying like be supportive, and supporting the proposer is really, really valuable. Like I see John educing his interlocutor all the time, and he'll say it sometimes, but like just the act of generously opening your attention to another human being so that you can listen as deeply as possible and notice their body language and help them see themselves better. It's really a generous role. It's not a philosophical, let's analyze, let's find the perfect word, or let's be really critical. You'll see that, I'm sure, Christopher, running those workshops, you've heard horror stories where people start to get like technical about the proposals in like a bad way. And it's I loved when you were saying that. I'm like, I want to be Taylor's wife. Please practice with me and educe children from me or whatever, because it really is like, it's a supportive generosity that you're giving your partner, not something else. Yeah, that was beautiful.
But can I make a qualification? The supportive generosity, it's really important to explain why. Why do we need the supportive generosity? This isn't about everybody being nice. It's not the point. And it's not about everybody feeling good. That's not the point. I know it's disappointing, but it's really important that people understand that, because this isn't about niceties and it's not about maintaining good vibes. It's the reason that you're generously disposed as the amplifier or as the midwife, as Taylor puts it, is because you actually are interested in the most maximally meaningful version of whatever the person is trying to get out, right? Which, it's like I want to get the most out of you that I possibly can. Now, it's not for me, it's for us, it's for the process, but I want to give the process the most that you can possibly give it, and I'm helping you to give the most that you can give it, right? So it's not, my generosity, the listener's generosity toward the proposer is not a kind of flattery. It's not a compliment. It's nothing like that. The generosity is a technique of trying to draw out the fullest extent of the proposal that's possible, because what is said by the proposer is like a fraction of what they mean. And so it's in all of our interest. It's in mine and yours, and it's in the interest of this whole process that what you mean is as reflected as possible in what you say. And I'm going to help you to say more of it so that we can actually reflect more of it. Because the more that is said, the more we have to work with, and the more chance we have of the logos catching in the process, right? So the generosity is a generosity of spirit that's given to the possibility of what can happen in the practice when it catches. It's not an egoic thing, right? And it's really important that people know that, because I think that people have their different reasons for engaging in this, and fair enough. But what it's actually for is to develop a conversant relationship, an embodied relationship, a relationship that actually gathers itself into a kind of fruition of character across time. It's a developmental practice for all of the people that do it, right? It's not so that they can come and and to feel good about themselves, or be made to feel good by someone else, right? My generosity to you is generosity toward all of the possibility that you bring as my partner in this process. And the possibility you bring is also the possibility that I can participate in too, right? So it's important to know what the meaning of each of these, all the forbearance that we give is really important. But it's important to know what that forbearance is for, so that it doesn't become confused for something that it's not.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also really liked what Taylor ended with. And Chris, maybe I'm not sure if you've looked at it in that way or explicitly said it in that way, but seeing this as a ritual, and a ritual for calling forth the logos. That is so beautiful. And that can actually, because I do feel with philosophical fellowship, we have this seance thing going on. But not necessarily with dialectic into Dialogos, but seeing it as a ritual calling forth the logos, that kind of does bring this spirit into the practice.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. That we do speak of it that way periodically, and yeah, I agree. That's exactly what it is. I think there is a kind of it doesn't have the same aesthetics of ritual that philosophical fellowship does. And we can talk about why that's the case, right? I mean, you could say, well, why doesn't every dialectic into Dialogos begin with some kind of, why doesn't it begin with a more sort of liturgical invocation, or why doesn't it begin with a pronouncement, or begin with something that kind of creates a container? And I do have my thoughts about why that is. And I think, and I'm not saying you were asking this question, Lizelle, but it's a question that occurs to me in real time, right? Which is to say, well, philosophical fellowship opens with the reading of the passage, right? It's a very kind of, there's a real format, there's a ceremony, there's a sense of ceremony about the reading of the passage. And in circling, at least the version that I'm coming to be familiar with, also circles also begin somewhat ceremonially, and meditation certainly begins somewhat ceremonially. Dialectic into Dialogos seems, I mean, it begins with a proposal, but it doesn't have the same kind of ceremonial window dressing that the other practices have. That's kind of an interesting thing, I think. And why might that be? And we've never really talked about that explicitly that I can remember, but I think that one of the reasons for that is because there is a little bit of a Socratic seduction involved. And, it's dialectic into Dialogos was reverse engineered from something that happened very spontaneously. It was reverse engineered and informed by a lot of background literature, of course. But it was fundamentally reverse engineered from something spontaneous that you just dropped into, something that took hold before you understood that it was taking hold. That's really important, because there's a kind of Socratic seduction involved in dialectic into Dialogos, right? It catches before you're aware that that's what has happened. There's a little bit of irony in the process, right? There's the Socratic irony involved in the process is that you don't begin the dialectic with the intention of it being Dialogos. Right? You begin in a way that's actually relatively almost more perfunctory. You begin in a way that is unassuming, and it's the unassuming, humble beginnings of the dialectic that are important. And so when the Dialogos actually happens, then it becomes something far more sacred, or feels like something more spiritual or religious, perhaps. But it doesn't begin that way, and I think it's actually very important that it doesn't begin that way, because I think part of its humble and unassuming beginnings are what create the conditions for it to become sacred when it does. Because if I think we go into it too presumptively, thinking of it as something high-minded and ceremonial, it actually has less chance of becoming that. It has to sneak up on us. We have to defer to it to do that to us. So anyway, that probably or may not have been where you were going at all, Lizelle, but that caught my attention for a second, and I wanted to wander my way through that because I had never thought about that before. Why we don't have more of a ceremonial frame on the practice, and I think it has something to do with that. So
well, the way it's currently structured, for me at least, I experienced it kind of theatrical. My pronunciation is not so good. With all the roles that we're playing, so it's a form of very much serious play more than something. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's also like to afford us to enter into a flow state together too, right?
Mm.
So sort of that gathering of the logs is us entering into a flow together. So yes, there is the, maybe more mechanical or performative sort of aspects of it through creating these various constraints and these roles and sort of talking them up. But there's also, that's why I like referring to them as there's these different asanas and postures. And as we go through these postures together, we just have more of that shared context, that shared reality, that shared understanding. I feel like there's a lot that's available in this practice, even if you don't quite get to the Dialogos. Like I say, I've really come to appreciate the way I see it is the genius of the structure, for everything that it is and whatever labels we can put on it where it feels, contrived or something like that. Like I'm very used to in so many authentic relating exercises, but they really are training us for something.
And it does feel good. It does feel good when you're playing the midwife and you see on someone's face like that moment of getting something that was inside me that I didn't know that I knew. And yeah, it does feel good. Even if feeling good is not the intention of the exercise, it does feel good.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. Well, it feels good in the way that when you're in a way that when you're sort of cooking and something comes out, something happens just as a consequence of, what you're doing, and even something you didn't intend and something goes well. You've participated in something happening, and it's the participation in something happening that I think is what feels so good, right? Which is not to say that, you need to somehow check yourself at the door and leave yourself out of the equation. Mm-hmm. But it's your connection to what is happening. It's the axis of that, I think, that it becomes what's so meaningful. Mm-hmm. And I think the theatrical, the comparison to the theatrical, I think is spot on, Lizelle, because it's kind of like everyone is acting a role in a stage play. And you have, the role that you're playing when you step onto the stage. What you're actually all after together is not the rote recitation of all of your roles. What you hope will happen is that the rote recitation of the roles will transform itself into a really animated story. Even if that story is scripted, in this case, it is an improvised story, so it is not prescripted. But the structure is prescripted. The story itself is not. But that analogy, I think, is quite powerful. And the more we do this, I think it's a very perceptive comparison you make, because I think the more we do this, the more I think of it. Maybe it's just because I have a bit of background in this, but the more we do this, the more I think of it as theater, as a form of theater, and that we inhabit certain roles, and that those roles gradually gather themselves into a powerfully unfolding story that is writing itself in real time. And when one becomes the other is exactly when dialectic becomes Dialogos.
It's beautiful.
I love that. I have not really considered it as improv, but that is what it is. Yeah. And I also notice there's maybe two other pieces that we haven't named about the practice. One, we haven't said anything about aporia, sort of its central role. You know, it's almost like, well, we're not necessarily trying, you know, as the amplifier, we're not trying to confuse the proposer. We're not trying to get them into aporia, but I actually think if we're doing our job well, they will enter into aporia. Yeah. And it's just, and being comfortable with that, you know, I think, you know, this was already said in not so many words, but I think John is a fantastic example, and even in episode 10, of how to do the amplification role very well. I felt very supported and encouraged, and it helped tremendously for him to be amplifying me. Yeah, it's that experience helped open up my past experiences of it. So to do it with people who are very familiar with the practice, like you get more of a sense of the potential. Whereas if you're, you know, maybe more with beginners, you know, like, you know, keep trying, but it's also like, it can be a little, you know, awkward and disjointed, and it's hard to get into that flow. Yeah. And then the other thing that I wanted to sort of see if I can recall what it is. It's the piece that's missing. It was missing for me, and now I've lost it again. Maybe it'll come up. Yeah, I don't remember what it was, but there is another
improv or
no,
flow,
it's a connection to something that the practice affords, and I'm trying to remember what that is, but it's something I became more aware of the past couple months and started bringing into the groups that I was doing and sort of naming this thing. But of course now it's eluding me. It's exceeding my grasp right now.
when you're doing this with your hand, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, it's the grasp, right? It's like, oh, where is it? Where is it? Is it in front of me? Or
I just love that you said we haven't said anything about aporia. Yeah, that seems appropriate, doesn't it?
I do want to mention, it's very good that you name it in the practice, because I have experienced a couple of times where I myself or someone else would be in that state of, and then just being able to name, I'm in aporia, and then everybody's like, oh, okay, let's take a moment. That really helps. That really helps.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's fun in the practice to just like kind of be a leader for a second and say, hey, let's take 2 minutes here and sit in silence and see what happens, or 5 minutes, or whatever it is. Like, it's really like those moments are almost like an expert therapist when they're like, I've never done this with a client before, but let's try it out. Kind of just trying to sit with that aporia and letting it be there is, especially like the first time or second time it happens. It can be just great to sit with it rather than just kind of not name it or not notice it. I've found.
And I think it's critical or helpful to make sure that you're pre-framing for it so that people know to look out for it, such that they know it's okay, such that rather than, you know, our tendency might be like, oh, I'm confused and I'm supposed to be doing this thing, and therefore by me not sharing anything or continuing my proposal, I'm doing it wrong. Like all these sort of, you know, things that start to happen to us, you know, and the self-criticism and stuff. And it's just like, we can name that at the beginning, like, this will probably happen. You probably will feel confused. You will probably enter a place of like, I don't know what more there is, or I don't remember what I was going to say. And it's just like, that's okay. That's actually part of it. And can we just sit in it and allow that to be? And I think the more that we can do that, you know, that can maybe ease some of the anxiety of entering into the practice. This idea of, I remember what it is now, this idea of orienting towards a virtue. And this is this realization that I had that, again, one of the constraints of dialectic into Dialogos is that we pay attention and pick a virtue. We don't do it with anything else, but what does that afford us other than, you know, maybe the possibility of internalizing virtues and living more virtuous lives, just something tiny like that. But in terms of a practice, in terms of those asanas and positions, to me, it's like, before we even begin, we're orienting towards the good.
I think it's important for both of these practices, right? That you're aspiring towards something that you feel sacred or reverence towards. Or I've sometimes seen people and my first reaction is always like, what? And then it's like, don't alienate what's happening, but they'll pick kind of weird things that I don't consider virtues. In fact, one time on one of the weekends, Christopher, you and Guy and John were practicing. And I think you picked beauty. And John's like, that's a transcendental, not a virtue. But you guys played with it and you
Yeah.
went there and it worked. But you don't want to just pick like cell phone because it's near you or whatever. You really want to pick something that you feel like, because a lot of times I'll be in a group where I'm the most experienced and I don't ever want to pick the virtue. And I'm always like, what do you guys want to do? And I keep trying to wait till I can start to feel someone excited about their proposal for the virtue. And I'm like, oh, let's do what she said or what he said. And it really like that we don't do that in pop culture. We don't do that in modern. We just tear down. We're really good at ripping apart. But to actually say, I feel reverence for friendship or something, or I feel reverence for joy, or though you go like, oh yeah, like you really, I think what you're saying, Taylor, is important. That you really want something, because these are all aspirational. I think that's the through line in all the practices. Is there when you use emotion and gesture and harmonizing with other people, you're really opening up your consciousness and your unconsciousness to like take in new ideas. You're being very receptive to like new information. And so when you attune to, sometimes, I don't know, these practices, I'll think about them for days and days. I know, Lizelle, you do these a lot too. Do you ever just like after, circling around courage, like find yourself pondering courage a lot for the next few days and going like, wait, what did Cindy say about courage? Can I find what she was saying in this moment I'm in at the line or at the call? Because it really like that. I never try to, Rand Lahav said this, and I've always taken it kind of seriously. I never want explicitly what's happening in the practice to transfer out, because it puts this expectation on the practice that it doesn't necessarily afford flow. But if you let it blossom, a lot of times it kind of blossoms outside of the practice in these really cool ways. So it's like if you're going to go on a date, you're right, you don't want to just date the ugliest person, because then you have to spend 3 hours with this troll of a human. You want to spend, I know I'm just being very loose with language, I don't mean any of these things, but you want to really set yourself up for a good date by being like, oh, I'm already excited about this person, and I'm already looking forward to this restaurant and these kind of things. That way, if it's like a successful date with virtue, that it does become this like memory and this second order influence on your psyche. So yeah, I just got a little excited about what we were talking about there.
No, but it was
Don't date
beautiful.
ugly virtues.
Right, yeah, you don't want to, I see people sometimes, I'm sure Lizelle might have even seen this on my face sometimes, because people will pick just weird virtues. And I get very almost, I think not as much as maybe Christopher or John, but I get a little protective of these practices sometimes. And when I see people doing things that I feel is like not sacred, the way I'm sure people, that just in any other kind of context, not giving it the reverence that I feel it should have, it gets a little tenuous. So you don't want to push that too far, but also
At the same time, I appreciate what you're saying, Robert, and I like the sense of reverence that you're coming in with. Is really it's very powerful, and I think it has an incredible, there's a great charisma to that reverence, and I think it's probably gone a very long way into gathering people to the practice and imbuing interest. And I appreciate that about the way that you're coming at it. I would also offer just sort of a bit of tension with that, playfully, which is that, this practice has to earn its reverence.
Mm-hmm.
So, it actually doesn't bother me at all when people kind of, stick with the structure, right? Obey the structure, give it a go. Don't just sort of make it up and improvise it. But like, if you want to treat it dismissively, but give it a shot. That's okay. Like, I don't think people need to come upon it having never done it before and treat it reverent. Like, expecting someone to be reverent to something that has not proven its value is a bit of a tall order. And I'm not saying you're suggesting that, but I think having a certain playfulness toward this is really important, and not taking it too seriously is actually pretty important too, ironically enough. And that's kind of why, going back to before, it's kind of why I like that it doesn't have a particularly ceremonial outfit. I like that it's not dressed up. I like that because I think, much like an improv exercise, people should be able to drop into it, have some fun with it. We talk about it. We don't talk about how fun it can be. Just have a good time. See what happens. The dialogos, the reverential quality, the sacred quality, that sneaks up on it if everyone's engaged. That happens. That's not the intention. That's what happens. And I think the idea is that if everyone comes in good faith and gives it a try in good faith and kind of obeys, gives the proper forbearance and the generosity and observes the instructions properly, as you do when you agree to play a game, then I think they can be quite surprised by how potent it can be when the fire catches. And it often catches people unawares, the way it happens when you start off just talking casually. And you probably, all three of you have probably had this experience. I've had it many times with friends or even people I don't know as well, where we're sitting, like we're in a bar or something and we're just talking. We didn't expect to fall into this deep reverential state, but it happens. It happens. It comes in from somewhere unexpected. And before you know it, you've gone from casually trading thoughts about something, or even casually trading barbs or something like that. And before you know it, 2 hours go by and you're in this like incredibly profound state of mind. The rest of the world has fallen away completely. And it's just you and that other person. And there's this infinite space extending out from the two of you. And you're like, how did we get here? We were just talking about a movie we saw. What just happened? And the thing, I think that it's actually, that surprise is really important. And so I think the reverence for the practice comes from the experience of having found yourself in a dialogos when maybe it actually wasn't what you were expecting. And if you go in expecting it, or if you go in counting on it, it's going to be actually harder. So I would say pick it up playfully, pick it up loosely, and see what happens, and let it earn your trust. Let it earn your reverence.
Speaking of 2-hour conversations, yeah, so maybe we'll kind of wrap up here. I'm trying not to have 3-hour videos on my YouTube channel anymore, even though I talk to people. I talk about philosophy, so it's hard to avoid sometimes. But I guess I think we covered a lot. I guess maybe two final things. One, just anything else in this practice, again, that will help someone new or give someone that's struggling with a part, maybe something pops out, and then maybe we'll do like a final thought as well after that.
I think that was my final thought that I just gave. So over to you three.
The thing that's coming to me right now is do it at least twice. For some reason, that seems important. Yeah.
The thing that's always for me very salient is that I think a lot of people are scared to do these types of things because they think they need to have some sort of mental abilities. And that's what I was thinking also when we were talking about how great it is to name aporia, because I think it's so easy for human beings to sit there and you can't think of anything and you think, oh my God, I'm stupid. I'm too stupid to be doing this thing. And no human being is too stupid to do this. That is a fact. If I can do it, anyone can do it. So I think that is a really important thing to get across to people. It's not the people that people see illustrate these things, you don't have to be that smart in order to be able to do this practice. That's I think or that learn it to be able to do this practice.
Yeah. I like that.
Excellent. So this has been amazing, and really useful, hopefully, to at least one person. That's always my goal with kind of like my whole YouTube channel, is like if one person, like I have something like 500 views on the hesychastic prayer that I have nothing to do. I just met some guy named John. He showed it to me. It's the best. I put it on YouTube, and like hundreds of people have tried it. Maybe, like, how thrilling is that? Blows my, even the first time, Lizelle, that we did that at the Stoa, I was like so happy that I got to share that with people.